In the second part of our lecture about evolution, we're going to talk about the process that is quintessential for the entire evolutionary process, the process of speciation. And first, we need to define what species are. So the classic biological definition of species is that organisms that are within the same species can interbreed to produce fertile and viable offspring. Now, if you have two different species, organisms of two different species, the offspring, although may be alive, will not be fertile. An example of such hybrid is a liger, a hybrid between a lion and a tiger, or a mule, a hybrid between the horse and a donkey. Neither mule nor liger are fertile. Now, members of the same species have similar physical and genetic characteristics, since the DNA is very similar. So, for instance, domestic dogs, although they appear very differently, they still belong to the same species, meaning that the hybrid between two dogs, for instance, Labradoodle, will still be able to produce viable and fertile offspring. Sometimes species may look very, very similar. For instance, bald eagles and African fish eagles, but they can't interbreed because genetically, evolutionary, they belong to different species. So the term for the cross-species offspring is hybrids. So hybrids are, for the most part, infertile, as we mentioned, because of the genetic differences between the parents. Now, when species are formed, species are characterized by their gene pools and their heritable changes. So a gene pool of species contains all the genetic variations that pertain to this species, but only the changes that are inherited via gametes, either sperm or eggs, can be passed to the next generation. So for example, if an animal has a mutation in a cell, but it is a somatic cell and it's not a germline cell, this mutation will not be passed down to the next generation. In order for the change to be heritable, it has to be encoded by the DNA that is present in the gametes. So reproduction essentially is what selects for specific heritable traits. If you think about this, the greater reproductive success means that a particular trait will be present in the next generation for a larger proportion of the next generation. So reproduction is essential for the genetic changes to be maintained within the population. So, in some cases, when hybrids occur, it may mean the incomplete speciation, and the term speciation refers to a process in which two species are formed from the original species. So, in Darwin's view, which is illustrated on the left panel, speciation is a branching process which creates new species as time passes. So the key condition for two species to evolve from one is that there should be two populations that for some reason cannot interbreed. So the speciation requires certain reproductive barriers that prevent two populations from interbreed and sufficient genetic difference between these two populations. There are two main types of speciation processes. Sympatric speciation, in which speciation occurs within the same geographical location, and allopatric speciation, in which populations are geographically separated, and that separation of populations results in evolution. So if you look at the evolution of modern elephants, you can see that at each branching node, more and more species are produced. So for instance, at this branch, there was mammoth, there was Asian and African elephants. Mammoth eventually went extinct. It's absolutely normal for species. And now we have Asian and African elephants that belong to two different species. So first, let's take a look at allopatric speciation. If population is continuous, in other words, if there are no geographical barriers between populations, then there is a phenomenon called gene flow. So alleles move across the population freely, and that maintains actually genetic similarity. If you think about this, if there is a constant gene flow, then it's going to sort of even out the phenotypic and genotypic differences. However, in case of geographical isolation, the physical separation may disrupt the gene flow, resulting in several populations that evolve independently. The reasons for geographic isolation can be many. And when these two populations exist in different geographical conditions, these different environmental pressures will drive adaptation, further pushing those populations genotypically away from each other. So there are several mechanisms of geographical isolation known in allopatric speciation. First is dispersal. So individuals move to the new location, for instance, seeds that float to the islands, or the known phenomenon, iguanas crossing the bodies of water that separate small islands on the pieces of wood and starting the new population on a different island. Vicariance. So vicariance is when there's a physical barrier that suddenly divides the population. For instance, a new lake is formed or a river is formed, or something else happens that two populations cannot reach each other anymore. Now, if populations are farther apart, that increases the likelihood of speciation. And here's an example. So northern and Mexican spotted owl, northern Mexican spotted owls, they stem from the same common ancestor, but they show significant genetic and phenotypic divergence because of the different differences in climate and overall ecology of the environment that the species now exist. Another mechanism for allopatric speciation is adaptive radiation. This is an evolution of many species from single founder ancestral species, and that happens because different environments can provide different selective pressures. So first, the population has to disperse into very distinct ecological niches or into isolated, geographically isolated habitats. And then natural selection, which will be different in these different habitats, will drive adaptation to the conditions that are unique for that particular geographical location. So species, as a result, radiate in new forms. For instance, the example here are Hawaiian honeycreepers. So Hawaii are islands. Multiple islands create essentially geographic isolation, which will lead to adaptive radiation. So for instance, they had the same Hawaiian honeycreepers, had the common ancestor, but due to the adaptive radiation, they eventually evolved to have beaks adapted to a particular diet. For instance, birds that feed on nectar have much narrower and longer beads, and birds that eat insects have thicker and more bent at the end, and the really, really wide beaks among the finches that feed on bird eggs and seeds. In case of Darwin finches, similar diversification, similar adaptive radiation happened on Galapagos Islands. Now, what is sympatric speciation? So sympatric speciation happens within the same geographical area, so there are no physical barriers. So what are mechanisms for the sympatric speciation? First common mechanism is polyploidy. So when organisms have extra set of chromosomes, it may actually erect the non-geographical barriers between two populations. Polyploidy is fairly common in plants, but very rare in animals. This polyploidy results in isolation in terms of the reproductive capacities and speciation. So first type of polyploidy is autopolyploidy. So when a cell has extra chromosome set from the same species. So for instance, there's a diploid parent and another diploid parent, so that's diploid gamete, and at the end you have a polyploid offspring. For instance, the tetraploid plants can only reproduce when they are crossbred with other tetraploids, but not diploids. Another type of polyploidy is allopolyploidy, when chromosome sets are acquired from two different species. For instance, in wheat, cotton, and tobacco, they are allopolyploid. So how can that happen? If you look at the illustration here, there are two species. One has two pairs of homologous chromosomes, another one has three. So when they form a gamete and one of the gametes is not reduced, the hybrid has 4 chromosomes, all homologous chromosomes from one parent, and 3 chromosomes from another. Now, when this hybrid produces unreduced gamete again, which then breeds with a normal gamete from the species 2, it results in viable fertile hybrid, which is allopolyploid, and now has 5 sets of chromosomes instead of homologous chromosomes instead of 2 or 3. So in some cases, polyploidy may function as an adaptive mechanism rather than an actual accidental error during the meiosis. So, sympatric speciation, in a summary, is when populations are not geographically separated, but rather have significant chromosomal changes, which results in isolated reproduction. So what kind of reproductive isolation can animals or plants experience? So the difference in genotypes and phenotypes may prevent interbreeding between populations, but for this it has to result in either non-viable offspring or infertile offspring. The barriers that prevent interbreeding can be divided into pre- and post-zygotic. So pre-zygotic barriers prevent the reproduction even before the zygote is formed. One example is temporal isolation, when different populations breed at different times. So for instance, 2 frog species reproduce during different seasons, therefore they are temporally isolated. Habitat isolation, when populations occupy different habitats. For instance, these 2 different insects, that grasshoppers that belong, crickets, sorry, that are occupying different environments. You see one of them is probably in the sand, another one in the grass, so they are they are isolated because of the different environments that they populate. Behavioral isolation, different behavior during mating. this different courtship. One courtship behavior may be attractive for the females in one species, but not in another. For instance, light patterns are different between different species of firefly. Gametic barrier, so incompatibility of gametes. For instance, plants may have different floral structures which will attract or allow different types of pollinators. For instance, honeybees in case of a foxglove, and hummingbird instead of trumpet creeper flower in pollinating trumpet creeper flower. And finally, mechanical isolations, when different mating structures are incompatible. So female and male mating structures become incompatible. For instance, in damselfly, the reproductive organs differ from species to species. Post-zygotic barriers happen after the zygote is formed, and usually it manifests as hybrid inviability, when hybrid zygotes do not develop, or hybrid sterility. Hybrids mature but can't reproduce. Example, as we mentioned, mules or ligers. Now, in case of sympatric speciation, there are other potential mechanisms that can contribute to this process. Beyond polyploidy, for instance, fish populations, when fish populations grow, the competition for food increases. So it may lead to a group of fish to try a new food source, the different depth of the lake, and that this fish will essentially breed within the group and will not interbreed with another group of fish, and that further reinforces genetic separation and eventually will lead to the speciation. So in Lake Victoria in Africa, there are multiple species of cichlid fish. They are speciated, they speciated in a sympatric fashion, and speciation events occur very rapidly there because of these differences in food sources. Similar phenomenon was observed in cichlid fish in Nicaragua. So two types, thin-lipped and thick-lipped, they exist geographically, but they are morphologically different, since these morphological differences align with adaptation of this fish for a specific food source. This fish in Lake Apuyeki in Nicaragua, they colonized it only 100 years ago, but already produced two very distinct populations. These populations already are independent species, but they believed to be very early in the stages of speciation. Now, after the speciation, new species can reconnect. This reconnection area is called a hybrid zone. So hybrid zones are the areas, geographical areas, where species that are closely related can interact and produce hybrids. For instance, this is why ligers do not appear in the wild, because tigers and lions are completely geographically isolated. So these hybrid zones can change over time. It depends on the reproductive barriers and, of course, on the hybrid fitness. So in hybrid zones, there are three possible outcomes. One of outcome is reinforcement. So in this case, hybrids are less fit than the parents, which results in a further divergence of species and no more hybrids being produced. That strengthens reproductive barriers and eventually prevents interbreeding. Fusion is when hybrids are more fit or equally fit as parents, which results in merging two species back into one. And then stability. So hybrids can be fit and no change occurs. We still have two populations two different species, and between them there are hybrids. So as we mentioned, hybrids can be less fit, more fit, or equally fit, but for the most part, hybrids are less fit, and that leads to the reinforcement of the reproductive barriers. Now, what about the rates of speciation? So there are two main models, the gradual speciation model and the punctuated equilibrium. So in gradual speciation model, species diverge slowly because changes accumulate at a very moderate pace. In punctuated equilibrium model, species undergo rapid changes from the parent species. So there's an initial change, the species remains stable, and then for some reason there's a speciation occurring. Now, most likely, these two models have to coexist. So for the most part, it's a punctuated equilibrium, but this model does not exclude the gradual change. It may not directly lead to speciation right away, but it contributes to eventual rapid speciation in a punctuated equilibrium. So what influences which model is more applicable? Environmental pressures, changes in the environment. If changes are rapid, that may lead to very quick speciation. For instance, a change like a drop in the water level in a lake may separate the populations of fish and result in increased rate of speciations in the small groups. So the idea basically is that there is a sudden change in the environment, then this change will make the genetic variation that makes a population more fit. This genetic variation becomes predominant. In the third chapter of this lecture, we're going to talk about the population evolution.